Yeah, okay, yeah. Welcome very, very much to Conversation. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program a personal friend of mine, Jonathan Rubin, and he's an ad hoc guardian at Litem for involved in, among other things, but particularly the whole housing situation in New York City, and that all within a context of it happening across the nation, and perhaps we'll even get to the idea of housing for some of the least advantaged members of our society economically or politically, to have decent housing that has been developing in the modern experience, a major process that one would hope would be continuing. But Jonathan, welcome so very, very much.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure.
It's always my pleasure.
Just for your viewers, I had three initial pieces of information. I'm a New York City Civil Court Housing Part Guardian ad litem, and I'm also a NYCHA Guardian ad litem. NYCHA, which is the housing authority or public housing authority for New York City, that we wanted to focus in on this show, is project housing for the poor and the working poor, and some people on government subsidies, but also the Guardian ad litem concept, I think, was initiated around the Kennedy administration with the concept that the voters mattered, even if they were tenement voters, to President Kennedy because of his working class father-in-law, John Fitzgerald, who was a real working class politician of the Boston area. But most importantly, I wanted your listeners to be able to not only know about guardian ad litems who are tenant advocates, either at the NYCHA hearing rooms at 250 Broadway, or tenant advocates in the New York City civil courts, because there's ways that your listeners can generate a guardian ad litem for their friends, neighbors, and relatives, which is they can call the APS referral line number 212-630-1853, and they can participate then after they call 212-630-1853, and when prompted to, they strike the number 2 on 2 different occasions, and then they wait a while and they talk to an intake person from Adult Protective Services, which is part of the Human Resources Administration here in New York City, and that person finds out about the beleaguered or the disabled, many times, tenant who's in trouble. And so that's the initial step. Then the second step is a caseworker is assigned to the disabled or beleaguered tenant, and they do a home visit. And then if the tenant says they want Adult Protective Services to help them out, then there's a second home visit with a nurse practitioner certified in psychiatry or a doctor of psychiatry, and then they write a report. And then usually from the report, either the Corporation Counsel or the Office of Legal Affairs at Adult Protective Services does an order to show cause to generate a guardian ad litem or tenant advocate in the housing case of the beleaguered tenant. Now, I have a friend who was very sharp and lived in New York City all their life, and they were bewildered at some of the things that went on in housing court. They were surprised at some of them. They were not aware of some of them. And so you can be very sharp, but housing court cases can be decided based on hair splitting. And the two most important ways a guardian ad litem in housing court solves the case is they expedite what's known as a one-shot grant, and they can be pretty large for the tenant. Sometimes they have to be paid back, though, or they can do a stipulation or agreement that the tenant will no longer be a nuisance or no longer have a problem going on, such as an unlicensed or unregistered emotional support animal or service animal, usually a dog, or they could have a hoarding problem, or they could have a problem of somebody in their household or some visitor them involved in the intoxicants world.
You're talking a lot about the details of the way that works and everything, but I wonder if we could maybe back up a little bit and take a little historical perspective on the idea of the treatment of the least, what's called the least advantaged among us, which is often the unemployed, and there have been also people who've been prejudiced on sociological terms by the society in general. And I've seen associated with the idea of public housing, or NYCHA, New York City Housing Code, and the protective things of the Guardian and so forth. But it began after, this is my thought, and I want you to set me straight, that the real thought came, unlike the historical pattern where the least among us, the very poor or the wretched of the earth, or whatever you want to call it, in the old days of things, maybe 100, 200, 300 years back and so forth, they were left to die in the gutter of poverty, and there was no sense that there was any need to bother with the least advantaged. They just couldn't cut it, and they didn't deserve to, and they were allowed to die because they were having no spokesman for them, because the power all resided, maybe in a king or in a duke or in some other authority figure for the sociological political organization of the society. But with the coming of the Great Depression, I thought, in 1930, where there was tremendous difficulty, Grapes of Wrath and all the rest of it was written by our intellectual community. It was terrible, terrible poverty, and there was a sense of that. And then it got to be with Mr. Franklin Roosevelt and his colleagues in the United States, was able to take action to create housing for something other than a successful capitalist or semi-capitalist who had managed to find a way of doing productive capability in the economy that made it possible for him to have the money to lead the life of a successful person rather than not, as in the past they were allowed to die. There was some attention given to the least among us in the United States, and the housing is one large thing that had to be provided, and that principle would have some application around the world, and it might have real application as we look into the future, not only the United States, but of the world. That historical context of the idea of the society in general taking some concern for the attention to the people who are what are generally called the least advantaged.
Okay, so there are 2 points that are very important to focus on. Mm-hmm. One is guardian. What is a guardian? The second point is what is NYCHA and public housing authorities.
Well, that's the detail of it,
historically. Mm-hmm. So a guardian can be, there's a guardian ad litem in the housing court, which is a tenant advocate. Sometimes in the housing court, based on the psychological character of the beleaguered tenant, there's what's known as an Article 81 guardian. And oftentimes, when the word guardian is used very loosely, they're referring to the Article 81 guardian. And starting about 300-400 years ago in England was the concept of the Article 81 guardian.
Really?
That's a concept where the courts deem the person, and here in New York State, that's the New York State Supreme Court, deems the individual incapacitated in some, possibly mentally.
Well, that's, okay.
But it triggers a big business, because there was an article written by Rachel Aviv in the New Yorker about a year ago called How the Elderly Lose Their Rights. And out in Nevada, judges and Article 81 guardians, or what they call conservators out there, they regarded people who were supposed to be their wards, who they were caring for, as economic implements to exploit.
Well, But some people that have, there are people who have emotional or psychological difficulty,
but
and those people are easy to exploit because they're not able to protect themselves adequately, and they ought to be somebody taking care of the people who are not all wise to the ways of the world, as they say.
But a lot of this exploitation involved transferring the person from the place that they grew accustomed to. the place that they were happy with. And that was recently depicted
Well,
a little bit.
that's an assumption.
That was recently
That
depicted.
they were. How do you know they were happy?
Okay, because I've got a movie that I just saw.
Okay.
With Paul Giamatti called Win-Win, dealing with a person who he, as a lawyer, became the guardian for.
Okay.
And he collected a nice check for a while, and the person
for the guy who was guarding him, not the guy who was being guardian.
No, he collected the check from the government
for the other person
to handle for the person he was guarding of.
Did he tap into that for his own interest?
He did for a little while.
Do
Yes.
you think the people in that position over the history of the human society have likely been able to to create a system like that for themselves to benefit from the distress of the disadvantaged people?
I think sometimes, not all the time.
No, but that's one part of the social order.
But let's get back to NYCHA and the history.
Well, I want to try and put it in a historical context.
Yes, I said NYCHA and the history.
Yeah. Okay.
So there were a lot of social movements that happened in this country around the turn of the 20th century.
Yes, sir.
At the outset of the 20th century. There was the movie Reds that came out about 30 years ago.
That wasn't the beginning of the century.
But it depicted John Reed, who wrote 5 Days That Shook the World. Or
the end of the last century.
Yes.
Is what you said. I'm sorry. Okay,
the start of the 20th century, I said.
Yeah.
John Reed, it dealt with, who wrote, I think it actually was 10 Days That Shook the World, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know. They made a film of it. Yeah.
And then there's also Saul Alinsky, who was a major community organizer and writer. He wrote a biography of John L. Lewis, the labor leader. He wrote Rules for Radicals, a book about community organizing.
And there were, if I may, there's Frederick Douglass in the early 1800s was making a plea for the slavery. Remember, we had slaves,
I understand.
Chattel slaves like cattle that were treated worse than cattle very often by the people who had control over them, and that was no small matter either.
Yes, but you assumed that it ended.
And that was the history of the world, largely.
But you assumed that it ended in the 19th century. Let's be very honest. No, hold on. I have something really concrete to say.
Okay, do.
Douglas A. Blackmun, Atlanta Wall Street bureau chief, wrote a book called Slavery by Another Name about the Southern forced convict labor system.
All right.
And those forced convicts were guilty of something sometimes no more than loitering in the street without an ID card.
You're telling me there was some injustice?
Wait. You're going to hear about this in a minute.
It was
until the year 1960. Up until the year 1960, there were people who were judging these unfortunate souls who were arrested for disorderly conduct, who were not even lawyers, not even judges. They were magistrates or political appointees who could decide things on a whim without any legal basis. They could say, I fine you $50 because you abused, you were a disturber of the peace because you ruffled ruffle the feathers.
You're talking about the working of a court system that is not a system of slavery that we had, and the world had slavery as a main way of organizing the population of the world.
Point. These people were labor slaves.
Okay.
They were labor slaves till the year 1960, because what would happen when the unfortunate person, oftentimes not a Caucasian, was arrested in the Deep South, is that they would be tried by these magistrates who were not lawyers, who are not law school graduates, who are not judges.
You think if it had been law school magistrates, the law school people, the people from the law schools was encouraging the Constitution and the ideas of how the society is to be organized, and still allowing the slavery to be reified.
Here's how the labor slavery took place.
Labor.
U.S. Steel would sit in the back of the courtroom with their representative, and they say to this unfortunate individual arrested and convicted of disorderly conduct, don't worry, you won't go to jail. Just sign here and you'll work it off. And they worked for life in the mines in the most deplorable conditions.
I thought they were told they wouldn't have any trouble if they signed.
They wouldn't go to jail. They wouldn't go to jail when they signed. That's what they were told.
And then what happened to them?
They worked as forced convict laborers.
Well, then the difference between going to jail and a forced convict is what? You live in a cell for all that time, or you go out and big a public affair, public construction?
The choice was, and oftentimes the choice taken by these unfortunate individuals arrested and convicted of egregiously was that they became labor tools of the capitalist system. But getting back to NYCHA, getting back to NYCHA,
wage slaves,
yes,
they were called.
But getting back to NYCHA and
but they were slaves.
You wanted
essentially
to talk about the public authority.
I'm trying to put it in a larger context.
Historical perspective.
Okay,
I know that.
Right.
So in the early part of the 20th century, there were notable works that came to fore. There was The Grapes of Wrath, the novel by John Steinbeck.
That's after
there was How the Other Half Lives, that in 1890.
There were things written up in New England about slavery. Are you talking about slavery, chattel slavery,
or not?
I'm talking about
tenements and housing.
Okay.
What you wanted to talk to.
And what time period are you trying to reference?
The early 20th century.
Early 20th century.
So,
most of the thinking.
Okay, but you wanted to know the history, and I'm going to give it to you.
I'm talking about public housing.
Yes,
there wasn't much public housing going on in the early.
I'm getting there.
Okay.
So, getting there, there were 5 or 6 or 7 notable agitators in the system. There was John Steinbeck with The Grapes of Wrath.
But that came after the Depression.
Okay, but
in the 30s, not the early part of the century.
I know, but some of them came earlier. Everything isn't like...
you're right. It's not all just one day it changes. You're right. There's a historical
How the Other
process.
Half Lives by Jacob Riis.
Right, yeah, God bless them.
There was the Settlement House Movement by Jane Addams.
God bless her.
There was Saul Alinsky's community organizing and his writing. There was also the writing... wait a second. It was on the tip of my tongue.
We had Spartacus back in the old days.
But in any case...
Talking about the
But in any case, people like Saul Alinsky were not just writers. He was a person who organized communities and got politicians to be aware of the disgust at the corruption in the system. And as everybody well knows, Tammany Hall, a New York corruption political machine, existed well into the 20th century. And Mr. Roosevelt was a New York State politician and a New York City politician, I believe, before he was president of the United States.
I guess what I'm getting at was there something in the historical record of the United States of America or the world that had slavery as part of the way they organized it.
We were talking about public housing authorities and their historical roots.
Yeah.
And the public housing authorities' historical roots were people like Saul Alinsky, a major organizer who started the Industrial Areas Foundation. He was a person who basically said, we have to have social improvements of our society.
What about
moral improvements and poverty improvements?
What about
so in the 30s we had the Great Depression.
There you go. That's when it really got started.
That's when public housing got started.
That's what we're talking about. We got public housing surrounding us here on the screen.
So basically, NYCHA housing was developed by Robert Wagner, the senator.
And Franklin Roosevelt.
And
the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt.
And Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor.
Oh, okay.
So initially it was housing that was supposed to be decent.
And Social Security got started.
Yes, it was.
And a whole lot of other things that were really changing.
To be decent, safe, sanitary housing.
A decent living standard for the least among us. Can you imagine we think we can have decent living standard for the least among us is something? That can't be. They die in the gutter is what happens to them historically.
There was another economic reason.
You're trending on history's
But there was
curve.
another economic reason than just housing why it occurred. The other economic reason for the occurrence of public housing in the 1930s, specifically 1935 here in New York City with NYCHA by Fiorello LaGuardia, Senator Robert Wagner, and President Roosevelt, was the joblessness. So public housing was a two-solution thing or two-solution policy. It was a job creation policy for the Works Progress Administration.
WPA,
And it was also housing for the poor and the working poor.
Yeah, that's sort of new, I think. In terms of public policy, we're going to do something for the poor.
So the reason Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get, with his full weight of his support behind public housing authorities like NYCHA, is that he realized it was a job creation program as well.
Well, then by then you've already got did we fail to bring in Karl Marx and so forth from the left and so forth?
Yes,
and the socialist movements that were developing.
Yes, but
that was part of the context,
right?
was it not?
Well, they were these people who developed public housing authorities, unfortunately, were mischaracterized as socialists who wanted to do in the system.
Well, they could have made peace with some of the socialist critique of. The socialist critique was always wanting to have something to be done, not with the wealthy, successful ones. They're taking care of themselves, but with the least advantaged people. Historically, it was much worse throughout all of human history, until we come into the modern experience, maybe, and we're getting public housing such as we have behind us now.
Yes.
That would have been impossible any other time in history.
Right, but the reason
they would have let them die.
The reason it was possible, and I just want you to know, of the several million, or the millions, approximate 1.5 million to 2 million public housing buildings that exist, apartments or units, apartments that once existed, 250,000 of them are gone forever since 1980.
I missed it. Could you give the figure again? Is it meaningful?
Approximately 250,000 units of public housing.
250,000 units
of public housing have been destroyed and demolished forever.
Out of how many?
I'm not sure of the exact number.
Well, it would make a difference.
It's about 1 million to 2 million.
So that a quarter of the houses have been destroyed or something?
About 25.
Well, there is always, built-in acquiescence. I mean, built-in.
Well, let's get back to the reason for public.
I'm trying to see it in a historical context.
Historically, public housing came about for two reasons, besides the economics of jobs. Besides that, it was considered slum clearance.
Okay, slums, that's right. We had only brought up that term.
And it was also considered housing for the working poor.
Remember the 1889 in France and the French Revolution?
Yes.
And we had a revolution against those perceived things by the people who had newly come over to North America, who had been under the British Crown.
Yes.
And the British Crown had all kinds of interesting ideas of how to treat the people.
Well,
and it's called progress up the scale of the human condition.
The British Crown believed in taxation without representation.
Oh, yes. The point being is it's always...
And they didn't believe in liberty.
The point being is throughout all of history, 200,000 years of human existence on this planet, 10,000 generations, it's always been unjust. There would be some few living in a castle on the hill, and that's retained by the leadership sense of what's there for the few, and the few should live very, very well, and they will beat the bejesus out of and enslave the poor. Right. And that's just the way it's set up by God in the system of the world, in people's mind.
But I want to explain something, because many of the listeners...
And that was the only thing available to us because it was scarce. But there wasn't enough.
Many of the listeners think we live in a democracy and a republic. And I'm trying to tell them, historically, we've lived for a long time in what's known as an oligarchy. And there was a person on one of the shows who used to call the last mayor, before Mayor de Blasio, he used to call Mr. Mike Bloomberg the plutocrat mayor.
Well, plutocrat is a
And so
he would be. He was the leader of the Republicans.
Yes, but just so your listeners know, this is not a change in the American system. Because Federalist Paper number 10...
Yeah, that goes back to the turn of the century.
To the 19th century. Goes back to the Revolution.
Right.
Federalist Paper number 10, written by Madison Mosley, was warning of the rise of factions and associations. And those associations were the business interests. And while he was not necessarily against them, he didn't feel that the code words that people were using, like democracy or representation or a freedom or republic were really being honored by the system, because oftentimes the people with money and wealth had a greater power structure in the system.
Always.
Than the people.
Always. Tell me a period in history where that wasn't the case. You had a king in the hill, and they have knights, and they have the people, and they beat the bejesus out of the people, or they would convince them that they'd better damn well do what they're told, like a serf.
Right.
And the serfdom was normal throughout the whole world.
No, I'm not saying it's different. I'm saying
that's what I'm trying to say.
I'm saying there were lofty ideals, and those lofty ideals.
Yeah, but they were not able to be met.
But those
you didn't have the material reality to make it possible for everybody to have a good standard of living.
But every 4 years, when these people run for leader or president of our country, they have sound bites, or they have media discussions in very brief, about how they're going to restore the democracy, or how they're going to restore the country for the people.
Well,
right now we live in the most corporatized government of our lifetimes.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. But the point being really that I'm trying to get at, and maybe I should just shut up and let let it go and everything. But is there something unique about the time in which we were born into? Or let's say my kids, or something like that, where there's something unique where we're able to provide, within the context that we have in terms of the capital formation and the capability of the technological development, we can produce more food, we can produce more housing, we can do it. We couldn't do it. You couldn't have had buildings like that in 1789. You had little log cabins that had to take months to build.
But as I said,
so what I'm trying to say,
yes, the technology improved.
Right. So the more and more people are able, by our technological capability, to be provided for, and it's slowly becoming a matter that you don't have to let them die in the gutter as we did. You had to accept that no matter what your leaning was. But now it may be we can take care of everybody, and that principle can begin, honest to God, in our lifetime, to the whole world. We can take care of the whole world in a have-like way and provide for that, which we've never been able to do physically. That's the point that we want to make.
I think we can, but there's a difference that's being espoused in the government of the United States.
In the whole political system. It's reifying the outdated institutions. They used to have kings, but they had to get rid of the kings.
But it's not doing it well. It's not doing it in the direction you were just discussing. The current president of the United States believes, like in the 1930s, when we had when we had Henry Ford and we had Charles.
Careful, Henry Ford used to tinker in my grandmother's garage in Detroit.
When we had Father Coughlin. And we had Charles Lindbergh.
My family's
and Charles Lindbergh. And these folks, they believed in America first and isolationism.
America first and
isolationism, meaning ignore what goes on in the rest of the world.
Well, yeah, but or in their own country. It's in their own. It's in the DNA of the population, and it reflected the material reality. You couldn't take care of everybody.
But the hate that's been generated in the last several years has caused us to approach a system right now where we're trying to pull out of our commitments to NATO and our commitments to Europe and the rest of the world.
That's a policy question, but that's not the question of what's the case. We did not have the capability.
We didn't have the technology.
Historically, we could not provide the people in 1776 with an Empire State Building.
Correct.
Or with a Central Park.
Correct.
Or with central heating.
Correct.
Or central clear water and all those things. You couldn't have the capability to do that. We're now getting to where that excuse of saying if some are going to live well, others have to live bad. They have to live down.
No,
but that's been accepted throughout all of history.
Yes, of course.
For the few to live on the hill, they have to be allowed, and the others can die, if far as we're concerned.
But
that's been the pattern of the evolution of the species.
But the big thing that undergirded the creation of NYCHA and public housing authorities.
Okay, thank you. Back to NYCHA.
And public housing authorities in the United States is, yes, Franklin Roosevelt was a major.
He made also Social Security, which is a major thing.
But as a major leader, he created the first public housing authorities mainly
Thank you, Mr. President.
mainly because it was the best job creation program going.
Well, all right, that did work. They're still
And so
going
he-
on the labor
so
theory
he put
of
the
value.
full weight of his presidency behind this bill to create public housing, whereas he did not do that with all the other legislation. Because
Yeah, he
not
was very-
only,
yeah, right.
Because not only was
Right.
it providing
That's
housing
right.
for the poor and the
Right.
working poor and
Yeah,
slum
right,
clearance,
right.
it was also providing jobs for the many made unemployed by the Great Depression.
Yes, and there were things available to people to have a job producing the goods that were not able to be available 100 years before. You couldn't have done it. You couldn't have buildings like that in 1776.
Correct.
You couldn't have clean water everywhere, highways, automobiles, all that.
But you know what? You talked about highways and automobiles, and that brings me
well,
to...
I'm from Detroit.
That brings me to another developer, or what they called America's builder, Robert Moses. Now, Robert
he
Moses...
tore the country apart.
But
New
Robert
York.
Moses is hated by a lot of people.
Well, he
And
did
there was
bring
a
a lot of...
There was a professor that I had a lot of respect for, Professor Marshall Berman from City College.
Okay.
And Marshall Berman and his neighbors struck and rioted a lot about what Robert Moses did in the creation of the Cross Bronx Expressway, because they had lived for generations in the housing that they were uprooted from. I'm not saying...
Yeah, okay.
I never said...
Yeah.
I want to be very clear here.
Yeah.
I never said development and gentrification or even transportation development doesn't occur without disgusting many people. It's the way of the world. More is modern. Using the automobile is modern. Using mass transit is modern.
I think there's big changes coming in both those quarters.
Having more housing and making way for these transportation vehicles such as the subway car and the automobile took precedence to some people over the rootedness of certain people in their communities.
I agree. Sometimes on the subway, I wonder how the hell they ever cut those tunnels.
But
how could they get through that rock?
But this is an amazing thing that I
With
also
a pickaxe?
I studied this little piece of information.
Oh, okay.
Because I researched it. There was a Long Islander in East Islip named Horace Havemeyer. And Horace Havemeyer was against Robert Moses and Mayor Al Smith opening the beaches of Long Island to the people of New York City. He said to Al Smith in a private meeting with Moses and Al Smith, "We don't want the rabble from your city, sir,
rabble
in our from the city, not your city." It was his city too, actually, because Al Smith was from the tenements of New York City, on the Lower East Side.
That's slums.
The tenements.
Slums.
Yes.
Yeah. That's
so Smith grinned and said, "Why, the rebel? That's me." And guess what? The Southern Boulevard and Northern Boulevard Causeway was open to the people of the city.
To what effect?
It allowed them recreation and displacement of being upset at their daily existence and peaceful and happy times at the beach. And I can assure you there were less...
You should be at Chamber of Commerce, man.
There were less...
Selling the benefits of the happiness at the beach.
There were less riots and crime in the city, in the tenements and the slums.
At the beach.
And slums... in the horror of the heat of the city without air conditioning.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So when you get the people of the city to a place that allows them recreation and lounging and enjoyment of the sun and the water, you divert them from the horror of the stifling heat in the city.
Yes, that's it. But
Al Smith and Robert Moses, while not perfect, absolutely not perfect, that move by them telling this wealthy man, head of Havemeyer Chemicals, I think it is, that, this is the way of the future, whether he liked it or lumped it, was really... forward thinking, and it was really thinking for the least amongst us, and it was really thinking for the people of the urban area a little bit earlier than Franklin Roosevelt,
And,
but,
yeah.
but it was also, and Al Smith was the first Catholic to run for president as well. And when he was elected governor, they played on the sidewalks of New York at his inaugural ceremony. But the point is, I guess I'm trying to say is there was
Yeah.
a lot of social organizing prior to Roosevelt, but
Yeah, it's all
but-
of history, 200,000 years
but
of
the
it.
thing that weighed in against Roosevelt the most in creating these public housing authorities was it was a 2-point win-win situation. It provided safe, sanitary, decent, affordable housing for the poor and the working poor, and it provided job creation for many unemployed. There wasn't a combination of that like that in a different time period. Yes, people
Right,
always
right.
want jobs, but the masses that were unemployed in the early 30s and mid 30s,
It was horrible.
it was the worst times
Yeah.
in U.S. history.
And
that's reported.
That prodded the political leaders to do something about it, and Mr. Franklin Roosevelt was one of the ones that do. There's still a lot of people who curse Roosevelt for being anti-American,
Of
for
course.
taking care of the least among us, when you've really got to get some more money into the portfolios of the super rich so that they can build all kinds of big buildings and things like that.
Well, Roosevelt and his administration were attacked by some people as being socialist.
Yeah, that's a dirty term.
No, it's
Now,
not.
in a lot of terms,
Not to me.
some of your intellectuals really cotton on to the idea of socialism. You have the government doing things rather than the public sector. Public sector has a handful, what, a couple hundred people who own all the assets? And the ones who are really benefiting are just a couple hundred, 300 maybe, people, individuals that are benefiting at the top, getting all the benefit of the system
The
as it's set up now.
1%ers, the one-
Yeah. Well, it'd be not 1%. It'd be a fraction of 1%.
All right. You're
it's
right,
just a
but-
small
but I
percent,
wanted
and
to-
everybody else is essentially, in a downgraded way, like serfs on a feudal estate.
Yes.
You had a
One
king
thing I
or
want
an
you-
emperor,
I wanna-
and others were serfs.
I want to reiterate a few things for your listeners.
Okay.
So
do.
that APS referral line to start the process of generating a guardian ad litem or tenant advocate for your housing court case, you call 212-630-1853.
Good,
You
okay.
listen to the outgoing message and you strike the key 2 on your phone twice, and then in a time period from 5 to 35 minutes, you get a intake specialist who takes the information about the person in danger of eviction. The other point to stress is while housing was initially created for slum clearance, Public Housing Authority housing was created for slum clearance and initially created for housing the working poor. Around the Reagan administration, the voucher program came into explosion, and more often than not, the housing starting in the 80s in this country became minority public housing, number one, and number two, it also became public housing where people were dependent on public assistance or
Well, that would be Social Security, would it be?
No,
Yeah.
it would be called public assistance or welfare.
Welfare, yeah.
Or they were dependent on Social Security, disability, or supplemental security
What if you
income.
didn't have those things to give to the people that are in that position?
Well,
what would
I-
happen to them if
I
those
was
things
tr-
weren't there? They would
die.
die.
No, because there's another way that the poor were getting housing.
How did the
I'm
poor
trying to
get
tell-
sustenance throughout
I'm trying to
history?
tell you the other program besides the money programs that we've just discussed.
They could do it.
There
right.
was also the Section 8 voucher program.
Section 8. I've heard of that.
That's
but I'm not sure what that is.
a government voucher or subsidy where people, oftentimes living in NYCHA housing, that the landlord could charge $1,500, but the tenant is paying $500 because the government is paying the other $1,000.
Now, who benefits from all that?
The poor.
The poor do. Something benefits the poor?
Yes.
That would be subversive to the many people's thinking.
Well, it is to this current administration which wants to get rid of the voucher program.
it does.
It
Okay,
does.
right.
Ben Carson and Mr. Donald J. Trump, their housing policy is to try to either dump the program of vouchers onto the states or to end the federal housing voucher program.
Well, I noticed Mr. Trump did a thing. He got it through as soon as he's president. He got a tax cut.
Yeah,
and he's got a thing in the market soaring.
Yes,
and the unemployment's at an all-time low. So the terms by which the society would be operating well with jobs and people being happy and the fact that things are working well is something that he can celebrate. No, why not? That's the case. The economy's never been better.
The fiscal year 2018 budget signed off on by President Donald J. Trump, it cut monies in food stamps. It cut monies in Social Security disability. It cut monies in.
Well, those are all people on the dole. Why don't they Why don't they give them a chance to get a good job and earn some money on their own volition?
It cut monies for adults and families of developing children. It cut monies from public assistance. It cut monies from Medicaid and Medicare.
That's all public stuff.
It cut monies from Medicare and Medicaid, and it basically benefited the rich on the backs of the poor.
Well, that's the way it is in history.
But that's not.
That's in keeping with history.
But that's not equitable.
But what I'm trying to say,
that's not equitable.
History is not equitable. Never has been.
But
whether it can become equitable for all in a systems way is the question before us. It's never brought up.
Yes, but
because it's all zero sum.
Yes,
for one for one to win and get good, the others have to lose.
But
that's the idea that's in the mind of the public at large, and that's what is representative of the history of the planet, or at least of our species, 200,000 years.
Yes, but the Arabella Charter of John Winthrop had a different vision.
Tell me about the Arabella. What is that?
It's a charter.
By all means.
It was a charter of the later Governor John Winthrop.
And what years are you talking? 19th century?
I think that came about in the 17th century.
Oh, way back. Okay.
So that charter envisioned America, and specifically Massachusetts, as a city on the hill, as a model of Christian charity, and with the eyes of the world focused upon us.
We had the people throughout the year. We had people of spiritual, like we had Jesus. And we had Spartacus, and you see what they did with them.
Yes.
They put them up on the cross and crucified them for being so lame as to think you could do anything with the poor.
But you know what?
By the forces that benefited.
Guess what?
That's still the model.
Guess what? In 2000 and...
Maybe it's changing. Maybe it's changing in our lifetime.
There's a little bit of a leverage of the poor in the media lately. In the 2013 campaign, at least two of the candidates who ran for mayor of New York City did something uniquely different. They spent a night or a weekend in NYCHA housing to see what it was like.
What was the effect of that? Did they take a survey?
Yes.
Did they get it on tape?
Here's the effect. I got the effect.
Oh, my God.
I got the effect. You asked for the effect. I have an immediate...
No, I want video proof.
No, I have the immediate answer.
Get out your cameras.
This is an immediate answer that is so strong.
Take it.
Okay. The immediate answer is Mayor Bill de Blasio, for whatever one says about his mayoralty, has been a tenant and people mayor, holding the rent increases for unsubsidized housing to the lowest 5 years in the 70 years that they've kept records. Point two, Mayor Bill de Blasio has extended the right to counsel in housing court for people facing eviction to about 75% to 80% of the public. It's not phased in every single area of New York City right now, but many of the poor who would otherwise be evicted because they would not get it together to do everything.
Would not get it together. Maybe get active employment and be a good citizen by getting a job that pays for it and pays the kiddies.
No, maybe they
out of good hard labor.
Maybe they couldn't pay the $5,000 to $10,000 legal fees to keep their home.
But those lawyers have to live. You know, they got vacations waiting for them in the Caribbean. I mean, they have to get down. They got to get on the top floor at the big hotels.
The legal services attorneys have no problem making money. They all make a beautiful.
I've noticed.
They make
the people at the top and their in the royal families of Europe, they had servants.
Yeah, but you mischaracterize something. I want to say something. You mischaracterize.
You're so beautiful, Queen. Ugly.
Harold, you mischaracterize something. Yes, the Wall Street lawyers, the brokerage house lawyers, the white shoe law firm lawyers, those guys make $500,000.
Well, they work hard.
Right, but the lawyers who work harder in housing court, who deal with emergency problems.
Don't forget our fellow here. What's his name who's got the program on MNN?
Shannon Taylor.
No, the guy with
Mike McKee.
Mike McKee is a hero. He's been there at MNN. Ladies and gentlemen, this is coming out on MNN. This is not CBS. This is not NBC. This is not CNA. This is public access. And that's the real people. We're the real people here. And Mike McKee is it. He's got a program. He's there as long as I have. He was there when I came, I think. I think I may have been a few months ahead, but we're old timers, and he's great. And what does he do?
He runs a group called Tenants and Neighbors, or New York State Tenants and Neighbors Coalition. It's pretty much the same thing, and they advocate for people in housing court. But what don't
they serve a good thing for the people?
Yes, they do. But I wanted to be very clear. Not every lawyer,
Josie Ann,
not every
people
lawyer
who work hard here. They work hard.
Not every lawyer makes $60,000 a year. A lot of the public service lawyers make a low salary. I myself have been lucky in 1 year of the 13 that I worked in to make $19,000. That's the best year, $19,200 in one of the 13 years.
Well, we're in public access, and these people over here are making huge amounts of money. You know, they're really rolling in wealth here.
I didn't mean to get mad before. I was trying to make the point. You asked me to come to the show.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was a little emotional or a little bit strident in my discussion earlier.
Yeah, I know you got the interest of the people in heart, and you do a great job.
I want to say
you're a good citizen.
You are too, Harold. And I wanted to say, I want to say you're absolutely right about the elites and their stranglehold over the economy.
It's called history.
But they've done it in a worse way. There's a process that from Florida to Maine to California called fracking, horizontal hydraulic gas drilling, quote, natural gas from the earth.
Yeah, they get natural gas.
But that's not a natural process. It was shoved down our throats by Darth Vader Vice President Dick Cheney, who was disgusted at the Nixon White House, which was one of the best environmental White Houses in the 20th century.
They had that guy with the faucet turning it on, and flame was coming out because there was natural gas in the
Josh
water.
Fox in his show Gas.
Another.
But the point is that the fracking process uses arsenic, radon, and benzene in the frack injection, and 20 carcinogens.
It makes a lot of money for the people who do it.
Yes,
lots and lots of money.
Billions of dollars.
Yeah. It's a big
But if
item.
they wanted to spend the money to refine the process, they could do that quickly. And I will give credit to our current governor, Andrew Cuomo, who in 2013 put a moratorium on new natural gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale, considered the Saudi Arabia of America from shale development. He said no more development of gas wells in the Marcellus Shale.
But do we need the natural gas that is brought from the rock in order for more and more people to have, let's say, a stove or an oven that works and it comes out and makes food for the kiddies?
I know a man
for the poor kiddies.
I know a man who does his own environmental radio show. His name is Ken Gale. His show is on every Tuesday night at around 8 o'clock on WBAI. The radio show is called Ecologic. And Ken Gale says if we wanted to, certainly in this state and in this city, we could live on renewable energy. And he really believes that. And then there's the flip side of that. One of the things our president did, which was very harmful, was the tariffs on solar panels coming in from China, because the Chinese found a way to make them cheaper than we did, and he didn't want them to make a big economic income from the benefit of our use of solar panels. Solar panels have been refined to the point where they generate energy even at night when there's no sunlight, too.
Maybe. Jim Hansen is still up at Columbia, you know. Did you talk to him? No. Jim Hansen is saying that all those things, it's good, you can do some of that stuff, but that fracking is, or they're getting that But he says the secret is atomic energy.
Well, you see,
And that we could have safe atomic energy, and the people who are making that not possible are getting in the way, and it's already there. You don't have to go and frack, and you don't have to cover the planet with panels and things like that that really get in the way, and that is not a thing that we need to tap into the atomic energy.
Well, there are two things
for electricity and for power.
There are two things that,
and we could get a source of it already. You know why? Because the source of the electric energy stored in the atomic process and so forth is primarily it's also coexisting in the tridents.
Right, but
the Trident submarines have enough destructive capability in the American fleet to destroy the entire Homo sapiens species.
Right.
That's a major mark in history.
But you said that,
and they could tap into that for electricity.
You made a little bit of,
and people are not thinking that's possible because they want to see sort of a Mother Nature-oriented thing.
You made a little bit of an inaccurate statement.
Maybe.
The solar panels don't have to be in the way. They can be on the top of the buildings in one area, while the cell phone towers can be in another area. That's not in our way. We're not using the top of buildings as basketball courts, are we?
No, but why isn't that's the thing from the progressive side of things. Why aren't they going along with Jim Hansen and saying we should tap into the electric can be provided by atomic energy?
Because
safely.
There's the history of Indian Point.
Well, there is that. Yeah.
And Indian Point has had toxins going to the water supply, has had many accidents. There was also the Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island accidents.
Yeah, I think they're overrated.
There was Fukushima.
Yeah.
And mostly, you talked about fracking. Why isn't that such a good thing? As I said before, fracking uses 20 to 30 carcinogens in the known ingredients in the frack cocktail or frack injection that are carcinogenic. So while we haven't seen a direct spike in cancer rates, because you can't link the water supply to the cancer rates, cancer is a problem. It's not getting better. And yes, fracking has allowed the landowners in these areas where they do the fracking to make their million. Yes, it's allowed employment to increase in communities that had little employment. Yes, it's wiped out our dependency on Mideast petroleum.
Yeah.
Yes, it's generated tax revenues for the governments. But if it was so good, why did Calvin Tillman from Dis, Texas, go all across the upper part of New York State on his own pay, his own money?
Making the video of the
he was actually speaking to people who wanted to listen about the troubles with fracking, because he believed if we did fracking in this state, we'd have a massive problem. He wasn't paid by the EPA. He wasn't paid by the Sierra Club. He wasn't paid by the National Resources Defense Council. He wasn't paid by Clearwater.
Well,
he saw what it did.
There's a lot of people
he saw what it did in Dish, Texas, to his community.
No, there's a lot of people who believe in nature and all that kind of thing.
But the other thing is,
and they want to be in touch with nature. I
want to give a different take on fracking. Fracking took America, which was the third largest energy producer.
They made it number one?
Prior to 2000, to the number one energy producer.
A lot of money made by a lot of people.
Not a lot. Now, that's the point that's a little different.
Oh.
You said a lot of money made by a lot of people.
No.
A lot of money made
for a few people. Well, I would have. Slipped. My tongue, it slipped.
We'll forgive you. We'll forgive you.
Thank you. I'm trying to get the words straight and everything like that.
We'll forgive you, but let's be accurate about the fact that fracking profits have gone to a select few.
You remember Dr. IQ? You don't remember that on the radio? There was a thing called radio they used to have?
Yes, I know about that.
Yeah, okay.
I still have one.
Okay. Anyway, that's all good. But again, it all comes back to, I like that idea that we couldn't have had that in 1776. We couldn't have had that. We're coming to a time where we now have a technological capability, which we didn't have at any other time other than just what we're coming into now, that we do not have to have the poor among us.
Right.
The poor will always be with you, said all our spiritual leaders. Let them die. They had to be with us. We'll put them up on the cross. Everyone like that. They were just the losers of the world, and you had to have everything there for the winners in order for evolution to work its path.
Yes, but
survival of the fittest. The fittest will emerge and all of that.
I want to bring in...
We're now getting down to a point where we can make it for everybody, can become a have.
Yes, but
we got that capability
yes,
if we want to get it up on the table. Is it possible?
But we have
it's always been called
here.
impossible.
We have
and it's strongly built into the political system and thinking of the world in place now is that it is zero sum. For one to win, somebody else has to lose.
But
it's
now
obvious.
But we got to talk
That's
about
no longer
we
true.
got to talk about public housing authorities after the year 2013.
I think we put we ought to put housing for everybody.
Right.
Everybody should have housing. We can do it.
As a public housing resident, you ought to know this, I think. In 2013, right during his controller campaign, Scott Stringer produced a number of reports as Manhattan Borough president. And those reports showed that 2 to 2.5 times the crime, the violent crime, took place at NYCHA buildings, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, in 2017, I think it was, he started producing reports of the mold, fungus, and the asbestos and the boiler problems at NYCHA housing. And so while we have issues at NYCHA housing. The number one issue is the unsanitary conditions or unsafe conditions.
Yeah, but
number two is the mismanagement. Number three is the fact that a lot of the people who are the working poor, as soon as they start to get better in their life or a better opportunity arises, they are no longer eligible for NYCHA housing.
Yeah, well, that's part of a historical part.
But the biggest issue, though, is New York State does a pretty good job. New York City, rather, does a pretty good job with housing for the poor. But a lot of the residents in NYCHA housing are not the least amongst us. A lot of the residents are retirees or people on government support. Now, some of the people on government support are not the least amongst us. That's all I wanted to do. We have homelessness, too.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things left, a remnant of history, but I think we're coming into a time of qualitative transformation at an evolutionary stance, which will allow us to have everyone be a have.
I would hope you're right.
And then you would have what would be a thing like a maximally engaged population of the world, like a symphony orchestra where everybody's hitting high C.
Yes.
And everybody's realizing their full potential, and there would be an advantage to that if we can make it and not cling to the past, if we can make it, supply that into a working population of the world, and it's united and it's just in real terms, then we will have a resonancy that will interaccommodate us to universe, transcend it to what we've been for 200,000 years. We're transcending 200,000 years of human history, and we're coming into a new relationship to the universe. Now, that's a little bit hard to understand, but that's exactly the kind of situation we were cursed or blessed to be born into.
Yes, but you know what's something so sad? Something so sad in the last 10 seconds of the program.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've attended a number of Philharmonic concerts.
Yeah.
And the minority or the non-Caucasian population there is under 1%. I think it's very tragic.
There's a lot of talent out there. But Dizzy Gillespie and a few people, I could tell you, the real jazz guys have been, they participate. Anyway, the trouble is in television, you don't have enough time. We've all run out of time, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
This is a good guy.
You're a good guy, too. You
well,
care
we
about
tried.
The least
My mother
us.
thought I was. I thought the guy, but I don't know about the rest of the world. But
my
mother
mother
thought I was really good, Okay.